My name is Ron Weich. I'm the Dean at the University of Baltimore School of Law now, but in 1994, I was counsel to Senator Kennedy working on the crime bill. The 1994 crime bill was one significant piece of legislation in a range of bills that had passed in the 1980s and 1990s that really changed the face of criminal justice in America. You can start in a lot of different places, but I think an important place to start is the 1984 Sentencing Reform Act, which dramatically altered federal sentencing and, among other things, abolished parole in the federal system. So the truth in sentencing concept was embedded in federal law in 1984 and effective in 1987. In 1986, Congress forgot the fact that it had created a federal guideline system and began to enact draconian mandatory penalties, mandatory statutes. So the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established the harsh penalties that even today are causing significant over-incarceration. In 1988, Congress establishes the Office of the Drug Czar, National Drug Control Policy, and that has great ramifications both politically and substantively. In 1990, Congress creates the Byrne Memorial Grant Program, named after New York City police officer Edward Byrne. And Congress gets in the habit of funding state criminal justice systems from that time forward. And then there's a bit of a standoff in the early 90s because some senators, some Democrats want to enact gun control legislation. Republicans and the National Rifle Association oppose that. Republicans want to increase prison sentences, and Democrats still generally oppose that. And so there's sort of this building pressure while no legislation happens, and it finally erupts in 1993 during Senate consideration of the crime bill, and eventually it's enacted in 1994. It was a serpentine road to final passage, but Adam Gelb on the Vera website describing his understanding of the 1994 bill describes the bill as a mashup of interests, and I think that's a very apt phrase because President Clinton ran for office saying he wanted to put 100,000 new police officers on the street, so that was his interest. Senators Feinstein and Metzenbaum and Kennedy wanted to enact gun control legislation. There had been a number of high-profile shootings. Republicans wanted tighter prison sentences. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus wanted more money for crime prevention programs, social programs. And it all came together in sort of an ugly legislative process that eventually became the 1994 crime bill. Different players at different times were trying to achieve different things. So for example, in the Senate, Senator Biden, he was then the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee before he became vice president, and he had championed the concept of the Violence Against Women Act. I know he's also part of this Vera project, and he has rightly taken credit for that set of programs. He was advancing that bill even before President Clinton became president, but in 1993 he moved it through his committee. Senator Kennedy wanted to pass something called the Racial Justice Act, which would have created a higher threshold for imposition of the death penalty. As I say, the Republicans, especially Phil Gramm of Texas, wanted to impose stiffer sentences, longer mandatory sentences. The Senate consideration of the crime bill was a circus. I was there, and it was a very ugly atmosphere. Senators vying with each other for the opportunity to offer amendments that would crack down in new and different ways on criminals, and there was a lot of sort of free-flowing rhetoric about sending a message to the criminal element. The House of Representatives, then controlled by Democrats, had a more measured approach. They had much more prevention money in their bill. They included in their bill the Racial Justice Act, which Senator Kennedy wanted to pass and was unsuccessful in the Senate. And they improved standards for counsel in capital cases. It finally got to conference, the House-Senate conference. A bill was produced that was rejected in the House by a combination of Republicans and very liberal Democrats. The Congressional Black Caucus opposed what we call the rule, which was the resolution by which House debate would be governed. So then negotiators had to go back, and President Clinton reached out to Republicans, and a number of moderate Northeastern Republicans who could stomach gun control then won certain concessions, but the bill actually got worse from a progressive perspective from one conference report to the next, and because then it needed Republican support. Notably, the original House-passed bill had a safety valve for mandatory minimum sentences, and in the House-passed bill, that provision was retroactive. It was determined that approximately 16,000 federal prisoners would have been eligible for early release under that provision. When the rule was defeated and it was necessary to negotiate with Republicans, for example, Rick Lazio of New York, they insisted that that provision come out, and they talked about, they didn't want to open the jailhouse doors. So in that respect, the bill got more conservative. A lot of the prevention funding was cut, and in other ways, the Republicans gained concessions. Ultimately, President Clinton needed a crime bill. His health care bill was failing in separate committees of the Congress. The gun control goals were very important to him and to others. The Brady bill had passed as a freestanding bill, but the assault weapons ban was in this bill. And I very much remember that weekend when we were negotiating the crime bill with our House counterparts. George Stephanopoulos, now a New York media star, at that time a figure in the Clinton White House, came. It was over the weekend, and he was wearing just a casual shirt and jeans, and he came and he spoke to the Democratic members and staffers and said, "This is the Clinton presidency on the line. We need to pass this bill." And Democrats who were reluctant about different aspects of it more or less fell into line, and the bill did pass, and it contained a number of good provisions, but a lot of bad. If someone were to ask me what should be in the 2015 crime bill, I would say, let's not have one. And I say that a little bit glibly. What I mean to say is the concept of a crime bill, as we saw in 1994, is very damaging. It implies that we're going to address everything in one bill, that we're going to look at every aspect of the criminal justice system in this omnibus way. And the process that held sway in 1994 was very dangerous. It allowed for this kind of ill-considered parade of ideas, often not vetted through the committees of jurisdiction. And in that kind of feeding frenzy that others have rightly noted, you don't get good policy. So instead, what I'd like to see in 2015, if not sooner, is passage of a mandatory minimum sentencing reform bill. Let's finally get rid of these mandatory minimum sentencing laws in the federal code and allow the guideline system to guide federal judges. I'd like to see a bill that addresses prison conditions more comprehensively than the Prison Rape Elimination Act. I'd like to see a bill that deals with some of the rigid implementation of habeas corpus. Congress had this notion of one bite at the apple for habeas petitions with a one-year statute of limitations, but as interpreted by the courts, it's been much too rigid and has led to much injustice in individual cases. That needs to be relaxed. But I'd like to see all of those ideas in individual bills. Once you mash them together and put it on the floor of the Senate, a lot of mischief can occur.